Benvinguts de nou. Ha estat un acte una mica sorpresa, però hem tingut la sort de que el professor Corum està per Europa aquestes setmanes fent recerca i ens va oferir de fer aquesta conferència, amb la qual estem molt agraïts. Però en qualsevol cas, més d'un dels que esteu per aquí sabeu qui és el tinent coronel Corum, per altres visites, però igualment hem de fer una mica d'introducció, només faltaria. Té 25 anys d'experiència en la formació de comandaments, tant a l'Acadèmia de Maxwell de les Forces Aèries dels Estats Units, després a Fort Leavenworth, que és l'escola d'Estat Major, també a oficials de la reserva del US Army, i un punt també molt destacat del que vam parlar fa 4 anys és que va ser degà del Baltic Defense College durant 4 anys, formant els comandaments de les 3 Repúbliques Bàltiques. A banda d'això, també ha col·laborat en aspectes de planificació estratègica, que és en bona mesura el que parlarem avui. També el doctor Corum és historiador, especialitzat en història militar, treballat molt en l'àmbit de la història de les forces aèries. Per cert, té un llibre sobre la Legió Còndor molt recomanable, de les sèries Osprey, i alhora té un seguit de publicacions bastant gran, té 16 llibres publicats i un 17è en curs, més de 70 articles acadèmics i un munt de conferències que ha anat fent, entre les quals les que ha fet per la SEM, a banda d'un manual d'exercicis a nivells operacionals que tenim traduït al català i penjat a la nostra web, que no és poca cosa. En qualsevol cas, benvinguts de nou. So, James, again, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to give this talk in English. My Catalan isn't up to doing a lecture. I could do it in German, but I don't think you'd understand that. I was once actually told on a visit in South America to give a lecture in Spanish, but again, I don't think that Spanish would really go over with this crowd. So we will stick to English, and it's a subject on military strategists. I think that the idea of what is a military strategist, not just an officer or a commander, first came to me, or first time I heard about this, was about 1968, and I was a teenager, and my father was a professional military man, a soldier. He was every rank in the United States Army, from private to major, and he had some great insights after a couple of wars. And it was during the Vietnam War, and he said to me, and I always appreciated that even when I was a teenager, he would talk to me in adult terms. He says, about Vietnam, he says, you know what the problem is? He says, we don't have any real strategists at the top of our military. People that understand the big picture. People like Loris Norstad, and you'll hear about Norstad later, who was a hero to my father as the model of a strategist. And in fact, I later actually did some serious study into Loris Norstad, who had been NATO commander, probably the most successful military commander of NATO in its history, and came to the conclusion, my father was quite right, that this is kind of model for a strategist. But our problem then, and to a great degree now, is that at the top of the military, I don't even want to get into the politicians, at the top of the military, we don't have people in the Western nations, or we have very few, who can think and act at a strategic level. Now, I've been involved in teaching higher level officers, that is, in fact, from major to colonel at staff colleges and war colleges I spent more than 2 decades doing this. And of course, I've taught at war colleges. I've been the dean of a staff college, war college, setting up the curriculum. So I have some idea of how to teach people about strategy, but how to get there. And what is a strategist is something I've had to deal with. And I'm doing some writing and thinking about this now, and I just thought I'd share this with you, and I hope that when I'm finished with the talk that you will come at me and maybe agree or disagree about this. I'm a historian, and I always start with questions. I try to look at the original documents, and I start with questions, and then I try to answer the questions and come to some conclusion. That's what I've done when thinking about military strategists. First of all, what are the qualities that a good military higher level, strategic level commander must have? What are the types? There are different leadership types at the higher level of command. Now, how do military leaders fail at the strategic level? They can be outstanding officers from the time they're lieutenants to major general, and then they get that next step up to the strategic level and they're total failures. And that happens. And how do they do that? Because I've been involved in military education, how can you develop people who will be good leaders at the strategic level? And finally, what are some of the major things that work against sound, good leadership strategy? I have a gold standard American expression for something that is 100% valuable and sound. General George Marshall, who was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff from 1939 to 1946. And if you study military strategy, you should know that Marshall was one of the 5 or 6 people responsible for winning World War II for the good people, for the good guys. And Marshall excelled at the strategic level. He also, he never wrote a memoir because he knew that if he did write a memoir, it would become very political, it would get contentious. A lot of people who had worked with him would be angry at him. So he never wrote a memoir. But we have so much correspondence from him, so much discussion that it was recorded, that we know what he thought about strategy and who made, and the qualities of a strategist. In various writings, and he never wrote a single letter or article stating this is what a strategic leader is, but in various times and places, he made this actually a pretty good model. And he first said that a strategic leader has to have a broad vision. Now, this is what my father meant by the big picture. Not just focused on the military operation, but understanding the context, the politics of it. What Clausewitz wrote about politics, policy, and war. To be a good commander in any case, you have to have very high qualities as a critical thinker. That's pretty obvious. Professional competence, your full military training and understanding and experience. Right at the top is character and integrity. One thing Marshall despised was the yes man. The man who always agreed with him, who always agreed with the higher commander or the politicians, who was cautious or not willing to tell his superiors, no, you're wrong. That's not how to do things. He would not tolerate his subordinates who would not disagree with him, or if they had a disagreement, would not come to them and tell him the reasons straight on. Character was essential to a good strategist. And of course, that's one thing is very often lacking when you get to the higher levels of any place, politics, business, or the military. Now, Marshall used the term progressive. That is not a political term in Marshall's sense. A progressive was an officer, and we're talking about the post-World War I era, who understood the consequences of the aircraft and the tank and motorization, all the new radios, radar, all the new methods of warfare, that he was up to date and understood those things. And that is what he meant. It meant fully up to date officer methods. A good strategist, a good commander, has to be a decision maker. This is why in military education we do things like staff rides, we do things like exercises. Those are meant to push the decision maker, or a person to go through the process, make decisions, understand those decisions. Marshall added, very important, was vigor. Means health, robustness, but what it really meant is that the stress of high command and strategic level command can exhaust people. It's not just fighting in the streets of Fallujah or taking on the armored tank battle. That's exhausting. But simply being a commander is a high-stress, exhausting job. You needed people with the drive and physical fitness and vigor to withstand that level of stress at high command. A good officer, a good strategist, is a problem solver. One thing that you try to teach people from lieutenant and above is they're confronted with new and different problems every day, and you have to try to solve them. Now, I would add to what Marshall, in practice, he actually believed this very firmly. He never wrote this down. But I would add that to be a good strategic commander or thinker, you also need to be a good planner. The top ranks of the successful military strategists of World War II, at least for the Americans, were drawn from the ranks of the War Department War Planning Division. And a war planner at the higher level has to understand the capabilities, what the enemy can do and what you can do. You have to understand the logistics. It's grudge work. You have to put together, how does the amphibious plan work? How does the air power work? The transport. It is a basis that you understand capabilities. A strategy, you might have a wonderful strategy if there's no realism in there, if there's no capabilities. A strategic planner has to prove himself or herself first in that role as a strategic planner. I would also add a further thing that works out is that in the modern context, every major strategic level leader who's been successful has understood coalitions and coalitions in conflict. Sometimes your coalition partners are wonderful allies, but even your best allies will have different national interests or end states than you have, and you have to learn to deal with this. Some of them, like the great Allied coalition of World War II, you contained great democracies, America and Britain and the British Commonwealth. But they're also allied with China and Russia. Very messy situation. You have to understand coalitions. It was hard enough for Americans and Britons to work together. Then you take the other issues. So I would add that as an extra to being a successful coalition commanders. Now, this contrasts to a lot of the current modern thinking in the US and NATO militaries that talk about the strategic leader has tact and he has cultural understanding for people and he knows how to deal with politicians smoothly and he develops consensus in the process and so forth. I am very much at odds with a lot of the current thinking on strategic leadership, because it's much more about getting a happy process than it is about getting results. And frankly, I think the purpose of a military is to get results that are positive and successful. And I'm very embarrassed that the United States military has had such disasters like Afghanistan and Iraq. By the way, I wrote a book called Bad Strategies, published 2008, and explained strategic failure. And a lot of my talk is based on that. It's something, a theme I've been doing. I got in a lot of trouble, or people angry with me in the US Army, because in 2008, I already said Iraq was a strategic failure. And it's very obvious it was. Iraq is now essentially an Iranian colony. The worst possible outcome of gigantic spending, thousands of lives, thousands crippled, has been to enable and advance the power of the major Western opponent in the Middle East. So we got the worst possible outcome. And again, that was a strategic failure of massive, and of course Afghanistan, I can give you some insights into why we failed there, and it's pretty obvious. But when you want people who get you consensus and work the process and have cultural understanding, rather than winning or getting to a reasonable end state, that's a disaster. Another gold standard is General Dwight Eisenhower, who made very, very few strategic mistakes. The only grand strategic mistake that I can truly identify is allowing Montgomery to do the Arnhem and the Market Garden. Aside from that, his decision-making was virtually always very sound. Now, something that people don't know about Eisenhower is that he was a good listener. When it came to making a major military, and he's the supreme commander, commanding millions of troops, commanding the air forces, commanding naval forces, commanding ground forces. And he would listen to both sides presenting their staff papers and studies, which were very well done, and he would decide which one to go with. He would also sit down, and when topics came up, and one topic that was very interesting was a proposal by part of the Air Force, or the Army Air Forces as it was then known, in 1944, was to allocate air resources to supporting special operations, psychological operations in Europe. Essentially, providing 100 American aircraft and crews specially trained to support the partisans fighting in France and Italy and so on. And he's at a meeting with his subordinates, senior British American generals, all of which are very, very fine men and great names, and great naval and air and ground army thinkers. And they were all conventional war mindset. And they said, no, this is a waste of time. We can't provide resources to this unimportant stuff. And Eisenhower said, listen to their objections. He listened to the proposals. And he says, there's something in this, and I'm going to support it. So he went against all these other British and American generals, and said they're wrong. And in fact, Eisenhower was quite right. For very little effort, the French partisans, for example, somewhere in 1944, tied up 7 to 9 German divisions that they weren't first line divisions, but they wouldn't be fighting against the Americans and British in Normandy. It was a very good decision. But Eisenhower continuously made superb decisions. And interestingly enough, he had been noticed during the 1941 maneuvers. Marshall ordered these huge maneuvers to take place in 1940 to 41 to train the Army in essentially modern warfare. And Eisenhower actually is the chief of staff of one army, and he is opposing his old friend, George Patton, who has a large armored force. And Patton, as expected, carried out his armored offensive, and Eisenhower had planned his forces contained and defeated Patton in armored warfare. Just interesting. But as a lieutenant colonel, he was noticed for all of the qualities that Marshall expected, and he was put up to the war plans as a lieutenant colonel. He excelled so well at the strategic level that within a year he jumps from lieutenant colonel to two-star general, and then he's appointed the U.S. military commander in Europe by Marshall, because he saw the strategist in Eisenhower. Albert C. Wedemeyer. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He played a really big role into winning World War II for the Allies. He had gone to the U.S. Army on occasion, had actually sent officers to the German General Staff Course. And Wedemeyer, by his name, his father's background, spoke fluent German. He attended the German General Staff College, 1936 to 38. And he came back as a captain. He was about to be promoted. And George Marshall was a brigadier general, chief of staff. And he sat down and he learned everything he could from Wedemeyer about the German way of war, because things were heating up in 1938. And in fact, Marshall would approach Wedemeyer here, again, in the old army, a very small army. Majors or captains didn't talk to brigadier generals, but Marshall did. Marshall, when he becomes chief of staff 1 September 1939, he brings Wedemeyer into the Army war plans as a junior major. Early 1941, America has to start looking at the possibility of a huge world war against the Germans and the Japanese. Marshall picked Wedemeyer, a junior major, and a team of 6 key people to create a war plan for the United States Army. There was a parallel plan done by about 10 mid-ranking majors, lieutenant colonels from the Air Corps, for the Air Force plan. In 4 months, Wedemeyer created a national plan for war against Germany and Japan. The first thing, he actually had to create a process, and what he'd learned from the Germans is the first question is, what is the national objective? Well, aside from defending the Western Hemisphere, we had none. So Wedemeyer writes national objective. And for Germany, it is the complete defeat of the Nazi power in Europe. And for Japan, it was the containment of Japan. And he takes this to the Secretary of War and the Secretary of State. And they hadn't thought of a U.S. strategy. What is our objective in case of war? And they said, wow, this is great. They accepted it. The president accepted it. So he actually created the process, the first question you ask. Talk about broad picture. To create a war plan, you had to look at U.S. manpower requirements, U.S. industrial requirements, all of the war economy issues. He also started with what was the capability of the Germans and Germany's allies. How many divisions could they field? What was their potential? He actually came to an estimate of they could sustain 350 divisions, which is about right. It was very close on. Of course, he was our expert on the Germans. Anyway, he drew up a plan for 200 divisions that would end up by within 2-3 years with an army. Remember, the U.S. Army and the Air Force in 1939 was 190,000. Then you had another 250,000 in the National Guard reserves, 300,000 maybe. It was a tiny army. And to expand that, he says the Army has to go to 6.5 million. We have to equip 200 divisions. He's actually pretty close on, because that is how large the ground forces got. The Air Force was another 2.5 million at its peak. And the U.S. Army Marines actually fielded 96 divisions. We needed far more service troops. But interestingly enough, we ended up equipping 105 Allied divisions. So you go to American industry and you tell them, we're going to have to build 200 divisions worth of tanks, artillery, trucks, rifles, machine guns, whatever. And so the U.S. basically supplied Britain, the British Commonwealth, China, Russia, the Free French, and it came out to essentially 105. The 200 division was a very good model. Anyway, this guy develops the plan. He later becomes U.S. commander in China. He's jumped up very quickly because of strategic vision. By the way, the Air Force plan, the Victory Plan, was again done in something like 3 months. And we're talking of tens of thousands of aircraft, not only for the Americans, but new technology that would be fielded, the very heavy bomber, the B-29, which was just in development, as well as many thousands of aircraft of every type to support the Allies. Remember, Britain got huge numbers of American airplanes. All done by majors and lieutenant colonels. Being a lieutenant colonel makes me happy. It wasn't done. They did some supervision, but essentially it was mid-ranking officers that created the plans that won the war. Anyway, he's something of a hero. Now, there's such a thing as a great operational commander, but not a strategic commander. Everyone's heard of Patton, right? Patton actually deserves a great deal of praise because he was a brilliant man, a thinking soldier. Basically, from 1940 to 1942, he creates the U.S. Armored Force, which had been a provisional force. He wrote the doctrine. He trained armored divisions in Southern California, out in the desert, which is still where we train our divisions because there's a vast area and nobody lives there, and it's a good training spot. Terrible place to live, Fort Irwin, California. Anyway, Marshall and Eisenhower were old friends of Patton. They knew his capabilities. And even though he was getting towards 60, he was quite the model of vigor. And he got into trouble a lot of the times because of his big mouth and his actions. They protected him. And of course, Patton performed magnificently as an Army commander. And Eisenhower, it's in their correspondence, Eisenhower and Marshall, who both knew Patton very well, said that he was a great Army commander. We will never let him command an Army group because then he would have to be involved in coalitions. And his personality and mentality, he could not deal with coalitions at all. And so he remained as an Army commander. Later, after World War II, when he did have a higher political strategic role, he actually got fired for it because, again, he was suitable for a field command. Now, there's another type of strategic leader that I think deserves to be considered. And I've done some biographies of military senior commanders. One of them is an interesting character. That's Curtis LeMay. He had a gigantic effect on U.S. strategy because he was able to solve huge problems. And he was an engineer. He was one thing about LeMay. All of the modern models of generals where he's tactful and he's culturally aware and he's understanding and he builds teamwork, they don't work for LeMay. LeMay was cold, and nobody really liked him, I think, except for his wife, his child, his dog. But he was not a likable person. But LeMay was one of the key people to solve the problems. And he was a very young officer in his 30s. He'd only been commissioned in like 1932. But he's an experienced regular Air Corps airman, brilliant navigator, and he moves quickly up squadron commander, group commander, and is one of the first American bomber commanders in Europe. And we're not hitting the target. And we're not hitting the target because the aircraft are widely dispersed to avoid the flak. Well, he does his own calculations, and he doesn't think flak is as dangerous. And it's not worth putting a bomber mission up if the bombs don't hit the target. So he develops a very tight formation called the bomber box. And in fact, accuracy improves exponentially. And in fact, it's a very good defensive position against enemy fighters. This gets him promoted up something like 32 or 33. He's now a brigadier general in 1943. He's absolutely fearless. He led the Regensburg raid, one of the bloodiest raids of World War II. He's given command of the 1st Air Division. And he is supposed to be a diversion for the main strike at Schweinfurt, but because of weather, the two strikes come in at different times, which meant that the entire German flak and Air Force could concentrate on each group in turn. So it's a massacre. And he loses 30% of his aircraft, one of the worst missions. But he led from the front. He was in the first always line. He's so good at solving bomber problems that when they get the first B-29s working, they send them to China and they make him the commander of the B-29s. Well, they can't fly B-29s against Japan from China because the logistics are just impossible. And they start the main B-29 offensive late 1944 out of the Marianas Islands, Saipan and Guam. And these are missions that last 12 hours. By the way, it's interesting about the B-29. This was the ultimate Air Force. It had extreme long range, operated at plus 30,000 feet above enemy fighters, and it was going to. They were going to precision bomb. Of course, they didn't know about the jet stream and the kind of winds that you get at high altitude over Japan. It had never been discovered. And now they discovered it. And the precision bombing campaign is not working. In fact, it's failing. Now, interesting point is that about the effort put into the B-29 and the bombing campaign in Japan. I have a question maybe for the audience, if anyone knows. What was the most expensive single weapons project of World War II? You'd think it was the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. You're wrong. It was the B-29. Far exceeded the cost of the atomic bomb, and it wasn't working. Well, they fired Haywood Hansel, who's the commander of the 20th Bomber Command, and because LeMay was a problem solver and he knew the B-29, they bring LeMay into command in early 1945. And he said after the war that if we lose the war, I'll be shot as a war criminal. But he's the one that brought the B-29s, which were very cranky weapons early on. We lost far more B-29s to engine fires than we did to the Japanese fighters or flak. Far more. The pressure of building these 3,000 horsepower engines to fly at 30,000 feet, and they'd overheat in the magnesium engine block. Anyway, I can get on to that. He brings down, he takes the guns off and the weight, lightens the B-29 so they can have a bigger bomb load, and uses them in the city campaign against Japan. Yes, it was mean and brutal and cruel. He's also flying at 5,000 to 9,000 feet, which actually reduced the loss rate of the B-29s because the Japanese night defenses were so weak, and it was the high altitude that was accidents that were causing the B-29 heavy losses. Anyway, he made the B-29 work, and I'm glad he did, because in August of 1945, when World War II ended and LeMay was leveling all the Japanese cities, my father was on Okinawa along with another uncle of mine and getting ready for the invasion of Japan, in which we expected, after these horrendous campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, we expected 1 million American casualties plus, several 100,000 Americans dead. And so ending the war, and by the way, every week that World War II went on, at least 14,000 people dead every week. That's not counting the casualties. So ending the war was a priority, and my father and family were very happy that they ended the war. They did the casualty planning. They made so many Purple Heart, which is the medal you get if you're wounded. They made so many of them in expectations after Germany was defeated. They ordered something like 1 million something. We're still using the Purple Hearts that were manufactured in 1945 for all American casualties since. That's what the Japan. But after the war, he takes over the Strategic Bombing Command, and they did exercises flying around and simulation bombing of American cities. Turns out that they couldn't find Columbus, Ohio. It was badly trained. By 1947, we'd so demobilized. He creates the Strategic Air Command, or takes over, and he makes it the great nuclear deterrent. Now, he was ruthless. He would go in and do spot inspections, and if you weren't perfect, you're fired. But if you were doing your job, excelling in your job, you're promoted, and you get bonuses. He rewarded his people. He turned the Strategic Bomber Command into an elite force, and because we had a nuclear deterrent, we don't have to all speak fluent Russian. My wife speaks fluent Russian, but we don't all have to speak fluent Russian. And so I'm very happy about that. But anyway, that was key to the Cold War. He becomes Air Force Chief of Staff at the time that the Kennedy administration's looking at Vietnam. Interesting, the guy that is the strategic bomber nuclear weapons guy very quickly and very effectively creates a very effective Special Operations Force. These are people in the U.S. Air Force units, squadrons, and groups that train foreign air forces, especially Allied Third World Air Forces, and so on. And my brother, my older brother Mike, was an officer in Vietnam, and down in Muc Wa, Mekong Delta, in 1967-68. He was there for Tet. And I really like my older brother. He's really a cool guy, and I'm glad he's around. The reason my brother's around is some of the few times he had to call in close air support down in the very bottom of South Vietnam. They got close air support from the South Vietnamese. And you called up on the radio, and my brother said that the few times he had to do this, that he was screaming and blubbering and crying into the radio, and the Air Force forward air controller would say, "Calm down, Lieutenant, help is on the way." And 20 minutes later, in this case, the South Vietnamese flying A-1 Sky Raiders, wonderful airplane if you've ever seen it, A-1 Sky Raiders would come and put fire and steel on the target and solve the problem. And that's why my brother's around today. And my brother's alive today, and I'm very happy about that, because this guy, Curtis LeMay, made sure that had an amazing program. He goes from being the nuclear weapons guy to being the special warfare guy. again, very dislikable guy, but he was amazing. The guy that invented modern military airlift, William Tunner, again, not a likable person. He was an efficiency expert. As a junior officer, he's working in the ferry command. By the way, this man should be a hero to all feminists, because as the U.S. was mobilizing, we wanted all of the pick of the men were going in the Air Corps, and the ones with the best eyesight, and we couldn't get enough in 1941, 42, 43. We're just pushing the pilot production, and we didn't have excess pilots to fly the aircraft from the factories or to fly air transport routes and so forth. And although the Air Corps and the top leadership did not like the idea, Tunner actually was convinced to use women pilots. And two fairly famous American female aviators they recruited a corps, and they trained this corps of women pilots, who, by the way, had a superb safety record. Has something to do about women knowing, paying more attention to detail than men. I think that's probably true. Anyway, they developed this large corps of female aviators to ferry the pilots around all around the United States and ferry the aircraft. He is such a problem solver that the airlift to China is cut off by land. It's only sustained by airlift. It's failing. He is sent to India to put the airlift together over the Himalayas. We're losing, it's like bomber combat over Germany. We're losing huge numbers of transport planes because of weather. They're flying over the worst conditions in the world, long distances, bad navigation. He sorts out the mechanical problems, he centralizes, he does about 15 different things. Also takes very good care of his troops, gets them better food and so on. Immediately, accident rate drops to a fraction of what it was in some of the dangerous flying, and they're sustaining China. And of course, they're bringing in this huge tonnage into China by 1945. And even when they reopened the land route, the efficiency. So then comes the first big crisis, the Cold War, the Berlin airlift. They call in Tunner. And if you've ever studied the Berlin airlift, it's about efficiency and method. And this guy knew how to do that. And again, the Russians were defeated through the Berlin airlift. Through the 50s, he actually proved you could move and supply conventional divisions with airlift. He was so at odds with the conventional-minded leaders of the Air Force, they never promoted him past his third star. In fact, they forced him out. They forced him to retire in 1960. But at least two years later, they actually established the modern airlift system, which actually transforms strategy. When you can move vast numbers of troops and equipment by air, your strategy is different. The characteristics of the problem solvers. They develop expertise and learning. And I like Tunner. If you have a job to do, do it. Airlift, it's not being, everyone wants the air. I taught Air Force, mostly pilots, for many years. And, if you're not a fighter pilot, you're nothing. Well, if you're given a job in transport or ferrying aircraft, do the job and don't whine. They had very good analysis skills. And, again, they took care of their troops. They did all of that, even though they had some personal level understanding of how to deal with people. They were just bad at it. I actually wrote a biography of William Tunner for the Air Force. I tried to understand why he was so difficult and unpleasant and unlikable. And I thought about it for a long, long time. And then I realized, and I solved this issue. He was from New Jersey. And that explains it all. I actually told that joke at the Air Force Academy, and a lot of the cadets laughed, and they started laughing about the New Jersey cadets because it's so true. The leaders didn't care for that. I haven't been invited back since that joke. So, my father's gold standard, Loris Norstad. And what happens, and I'll talk about the ideologues, he's a brilliant staff officer. As a young officer, comes with war plans, of course. He goes and serves in the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean, they didn't have a British Air Force in the Mediterranean and an American Air Force. They had the Mediterranean Air Force. So for each staff section, you had the commander and his number two, or his chief of staff. One would be American, the other would be British. They completely integrated the British and the American, the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Corps. If a mission could be best done by British Group 15, use the British. If the Americans could do it. Anyway, it was a kind of coalition operation. And he worked extremely well. And he comes back, they send him out to the Pacific, does well. I wrote a monograph about that, and I'll send it to you. You can use it as you wish. He had to deal with all kinds of strategic. He was 12 years in Europe. First 6 years as NATO Air Commander, 6 years as the SACIR, the Supreme Commander. He had to deal with putting nuclear weapons in Europe, because that was the policy, nuclear deterrent. He had to rearm Germany. By the way, the Germans had been so incompetent were failing. They hadn't done proper planning. They hadn't done proper budget estimates. They had no idea. A few years after World War II, 10 years after, the Germans have no idea how to build up a military. And he basically behind the scenes, takes charge of the process and gets Germany rearmed. And in fact, thanks to him, the Bundeswehr worked during the build-up phase, which would have failed completely without American training and aid and money, but very quietly provided. He had to deal with the Berlin crisis. He had to deal with nuclear weapons in Europe. And he was the ultimate coalition commander, could deal with the Europeans and deal with the Americans. The new Secretary of Defense and one of the ultimate ideologues, William McNamara, wanted really quick and immediate changes in NATO that would upend the process. And Norstad recommended McNamara, within something like 3 months of McNamara becoming Kennedy's defense secretary in '61, he comes over and he berates all the European leaders, and he basically wrecks all the good relations that Norstad had built. And McNamara, the ideologue, and I'll talk about the ideologues in a second, had no tolerance for dissent or disagreement, and they retired Norstad. Interesting that our relations with France in NATO, and France will pull out soon afterwards, after they fired Norstad. De Gaulle actually got along well with Norstad, one of the few Americans he did. Talk about your flawed commanders. These are exceptional people, they're super bright, but in some cases it's great intelligence too narrowly focused. In other cases it's a lack of character. People who are less interested in the mission accomplishment than they are. And by the way, I was a subordinate for General Petraeus, so I know what I'm talking about. General Petraeus, I don't know if you remember him. Any of you remember who Petraeus was? He was theater commander in Iraq. He's very successful as a division commander in Iraq. He's one of the few who seems to know what's going on and to understand insurgency, while everybody else, like Sanchez early on, who's our commander in Iraq, was like a deer in the headlights. Do you have that expression in Catalan? When the deer stands in the road and you're driving down at night and the deer is just standing there with the big bright eyes fixed on your headlights, we have that expression. And of course, they can't move. They're just paralyzed by the headlights. And we have that expression when you have no idea what's going on and you're paralyzed. by we call it a deer in the headlights. It's a great expression. I hope you can turn that into Catalan. Do you have deer that you run into speeding along with the car at night?
We have boars.
Oh, yeah, boars. Okay, a boar in the headlight. But the animals will stop and they'll just look at you. And that was the look that our senior commander in 2004 in Iraq had. He was a deer in the headlights. Had no idea what was going on. Petraeus was a guy, he wasn't a deer in the headlights, knew what he was doing. And before he goes to Iraq, though, and he takes over the Combat Arms Command, and he will develop the U.S. doctrine for counterinsurgency, which he does with the Marine Corps. And I was one of the team of 10 people that wrote the U.S. Army Marine Corps counterinsurgency doctrine. So Petraeus goes to Iraq. He loved dealing with the press, and the press loved him. He loved the attention. He loved smoozing with politicians and the Pentagon establishment. And I think that he was also pretty willing to throw out good stuff in the doctrine just because somebody in the Pentagon didn't like it. But he will work his way up as somebody who's on the fast track. He wants to be chief of staff, ends up a CIA chief, has an affair with a woman journalist. That's one thing. You're not supposed to do that if you're a general. But he gave her top secret SCI information, which you don't hand to journalists. Now, I would still be in jail. This is in 2012. I would still be in prison if I had done that. And I'm mere lieutenant colonel. But he was given a fine, and don't do that again. Wrist slap. When you get a certain position, I'm sure it's different in Spain that when you get to a certain position, you don't get hit with okay. But, one of his staff, that wasn't me, but said, Petraeus is very smart. That's true. But he's not half as smart as he thinks he is. And he was, in a sense, he wasn't a trustworthy person. Something I wouldn't trust. But he made it to the top of the strategic level, and then crashed. Stanley McChrystal. Now, McChrystal was brilliant in Iraq and the Middle East. He put together what is called a joint interagency task force. That's all the intelligence agencies backed up by the special operations guys. And that's putting the CIA, civilians, Defense Intelligence Agency, along with the military agencies, all together in the same room, and essentially eliminating different barriers between the intelligence and the military, and having your special forces strike teams. And he's the one that got al-Zakari, who was the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was a brilliant team builder and very, very successful. He spent his entire career in special operations. If you want somebody to hunt down and destroy terrorist cells and commanders, this is your man. And he has, of course, had a great strategic impact. But then he was so successful as that, they made him theater commander in Afghanistan. And at that strategic level, he failed horribly. First of all, he didn't understand the politics of that at all. And the politics and the core of the problem was President Karzai, the Afghan government, and its corruption. In fact, he pretty much fell for whatever Karzai told him. He was much too gullible. And instead of having the right kind of staff, which would be a broad picture, you'll find that your good commanders like Eisenhower had naval people and had special forces and had airmen, and his deputy commander was an airman. You had different expertise. But he had his little crew of special operators, and they're a different breed than your conventional soldier. I was a conventional kind of soldier. My Uncle Bill was special forces. But they're a little wilder. They have a different culture. And so he didn't have good conventional didn't have that mix of people that you need on your strategic staff. And so he and his special forces team, and he lets a Rolling Stone reporter accompany him, and which is about the dumbest thing that, at the strategic level, you have to at least be cautious about the press. And his staff were saying insulting things about some of our allies in Afghanistan. Actually, they weren't actually fair comments either. But in any case, the Rolling Stone guy, now he wasn't saying this, but they were his colonels, and then he's writing all this down, and he writes this article, Rolling Stone, and he overheard never McChrystal, but his colonels making some comments about Obama, and Obama had a very, very thin skin, and so Obama sacked him immediately and fired him. But in fact, he wasn't doing very well. He was betrayed by the jerks on his, by the idiots on his staff. So he was what we call the Peter Principle. You rise and you succeed up to the level of your incompetence. You're brilliant, 3-star general, then you hit the 4 stars, theater commander, and nope. Now, one of my favorite strategists was Colin Powell, who was the chairman, U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the First Gulf War. Now, behind the scenes, sometimes in front of the cameras, but Schwarzkopf was the field commander. He was in charge of the theater. He did the fighting. But there's this huge coalition, and it includes Arab countries. Egypt sent troops, as did Saudi Arabia and Morocco. And when you have Arab countries, and of course, France sent a division, Britain sent one, the First Gulf War, very coalition, and his job was to keep the coalition working smoothly. And he did a great job. Now I wanted, and he was pushed out, but I wanted to talk about the 2 threats to strategy. And one is the company man. And the company man, and whatever the corporation says is good. Whatever the company man will never disagree with the boss. Whatever the boss says, even if it's wrong. Now, to a certain degree, any military, any corporation, academia is full of company men and women, and but they look in terms of the military, in terms of their service. And I was an Army guy working for the Air Force, and I can tell you there are different cultures. You take someone, they're 18, and you send them to the Air Force Academy for 4 years, indoctrinated in air power. And then you move them up through the higher ranks. And what is the answer to every problem? Air power. That's the answer. Whatever the question is, I guarantee you, I spent 14 years teaching Air Force higher level officer strategy. And for many of them, now a lot of them didn't, but a lot of them were really very smart, were company men. And I had the experience of that. You're trained in air power, and it becomes an ideology and a religion. Late 1990s, the air staff after the First Gulf War was, of course, pushing all these concepts that you could win wars all by themselves by bombing. Of course, they've been saying this since Douhet, but since the 1930s, if you drop the right bombs in the right places, boom, silver bullet, war ends. Don't need ground troops, anything else. Oh, you think people don't actually say this? Believe me, they do. I worked for them. Anyway, there are some in the Air Force that were absolutely air power oriented. And I get a call from the air staff in Washington, and because I had written some books on the Luftwaffe, and I guess somebody read them, thought they were good books up in the air staff. I was happy to know that some people in the Pentagon read books. And they said, we'd like to put together a book outlining the air power theories of Colonel John Warden. With air power, you can achieve strategic paralysis of the enemy by taking out, paralyzing his leadership with a few bombs in the right places. We would like you to write a book chapter on how the Germans paralyzed the British and French air forces, or French armies in spring 1940 by attacking their headquarters and command centers. And I said, well, to the colonel representing the air staff, and when you get a full colonel, that usually means there was some 2 and 3, some 3 stars at least, who wanted me on the project. And I said, well, you have called exactly the right person, because there are probably about only 12 people in the world who have actually sat in the German archives and gone through all the records of the 3rd and 2nd Air Fleets in the spring 1940. And I'm one of the maybe dozen people that actually has the entire picture of the Luftwaffe operations in the West. And I can tell you definitively, in no way at any time did the Germans ever specifically target any of the British Allied higher headquarters. Now, there were some French Corps and division headquarters that were overrun by accident by German ground troops. But the Germans made no attempt to attack the headquarters or the command and control. Said, in fact, the Allied command and control and communications, French and British, functioned perfectly in the spring of 1940. So in fact, the British and French leadership paralyzed themselves in the spring of 1940. Now, this is a great historical question, and I would be happy to write a chapter on how, without any assistance from the Germans, how the British and French higher commands paralyzed themselves. And I hear at the other end, yes, that's very interesting. Yes, we'll get back to you. Click. I never, ever was asked again to do a project by the air staff. I would have been happy. I worked for the Air Force. They could have called me up at any time and said, we want you to do a study. And I'm a good soldier. I would have said, yes, sir. And I would have done my best. But that's not what they wanted. They had we're talking ideology. Your ideologue knows the answer first. They have a fixed model. They know the answer. And you put the ideologues in charge. So if you have a lot of get along, whatever the boss says, and I'm thinking of one few years ago, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the U.S. military, and I heard this guy who had been appointed by the president. And I had a very good friend who I called up. He was a Marine Corps colonel, over 30 years in the Marines. And I said, do you know this guy? I said, oh yeah, I've known him since he was a second lieutenant. We've gone through our careers together. And he said, I asked, well, what do you think of him? And I said, well, he never met a superior officer who he couldn't completely agree with. And that's how I made it to the top. That's your company man. But then you have your ideologue, your true believer, who knows what's best. And I mentioned one before, Defense Secretary McNamara, 1961, 1968, who had been president of Ford Motors. The military should be run. He treated any military person like you would treat a division director of Ford Motors. Here's your orders, do it. A lot of the Vietnam failures and a lot of the failures that come from the 60s come from the ideologies. And I wrote, I won't even go into detail, I'll keep you here all evening. Bad strategies, I gave Paul a copy, an e-copy. Happy to share that with you. Why did we make such mistakes in Vietnam? Well, the ideologues take over the process. And when the ideologue does that, the ideologues allow no dissent, no disagreement, no critical thinking to their ideology. So you have characters like Walt Rostow coming up. Now he is, he's one of the deputy secretaries. He has an important role in the Defense Department. He was he loved his statistics and models. And he developed a model that if you bomb 94 targets in North Vietnam, they will surrender in 6 weeks. And largely because of Walt Rostow, we turned on the bombing campaign in 1965. And we ended up bombing the 94 targets. Guess what happened? North Vietnam surrendered, right? Yeah. But then, you know, they finally got rid of McNamara because years into pushing the bombing campaign, the other things, and I wrote Bad Strategies, how ideologues had taken over in Iraq and taken over the strategy, and they would allow no dissent, no rational argument, no intelligent war planning, and that's how you ended up. But the biggest danger to good strategy, the company man goes along, gets along, and the ideologue corrupts the entire process. And this is what we get. And this explains, I will tell you, the company man and the ideologue, there are a lot of really smart people in the U.S. military and the defense establishment. But the company man and the ideologue will make sure the really smart people are at least the ones that know what they're doing. Colin Powell is the case study. He came up with what was called the Powell Doctrine. And this is basically a restatement of stuff that goes back to the 1950s when Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway kept America from out of sending a massive army or making a military commitment to the French in Indochina. He says, when you're facing conflict, what is our national interest? Do we have a clear objective? What end state do you want? What resources are you willing to apply? Is there political support for this? What other factors might cause a problem? What are your collision issues? And have we thought all of this through? Now, this is pretty basic stuff. And this is even after orchestrating the first Gulf War. After the first Gulf War, everybody saw the vast military power in the Soviet Union had collapsed. And so people were thinking, Europeans too, but a whole school of Americans, let's use our military and intervene to make the world better and to make people more democratic and improve economies. Let's get involved in Yugoslavia, which, of course, absolutely minimal U.S. national interest, but let's get involved there and make things better. And so we get involved in Yugoslavia. And I could talk about that. But Somalia, let's go in and do some good and feed and help people. And of course, hopefully we've all seen Black Hawk Down. I watched that movie with a guy that had been there. Actually been a special forces guy. I was turning to him during the movie when they're showing the formations and saying, do they actually fly like that? And he says, oh yeah, that's pretty accurate. But we had no objective except do something good. We intervened in Haiti in the mid-90s and it didn't help. We actually had a large force there for a year and then we left and it was worse than ever. But this desire for the United States, and then in Afghanistan, let's take a medieval Islamic country, 15% literate, and let's make them a Western-style democracy. Now, I'm sure that I have lots of my dearest friends. I served briefly in Iraq. I wasn't in Afghanistan, but some of my closest friends were. And they actually had State Department people showing up in their province and saying, we're here to help organize the women and so forth. And my friends having to try to get them out because they didn't want the bombs to start going off the next week, which would have happened when you try to. We were sending people over to teach modern art and women's rights. And fortunately, you do that in Afghanistan, that will make people join the Taliban. In fact, that's what happened. And I could talk about all of the stupid things, but some of the stupidest was actually getting in their face. We did a lot of really stupid things in Iraq too, largely from the good intentions. People that didn't have a realistic end state. And I talked about realistic end states that we had. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is another enemy of good strategy is bureaucracy. Those are good figures there. U.S. military, 9.2 million troops. It would get up to over 11 million end of 1944. We had 9 4-star generals and admirals, 1 per every million soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Today, we have 23 4-star generals and admirals for 2.14 million total, including reserves in the U.S. military. In the Pentagon, 1945, you had 33,000 people working there. Now, in those days, everything was done by paper and telex. So you had thousands of typists typing out orders all day long. One of them was my mother. That was her first job, was working in the Pentagon, typing away. But we, at that point, had about close to 12 million military personnel. So the command center has 33,000. Today, for 2.14 million at our command center, we have 28,000. The bureaucracy, it's almost as bad as academia, and I can tell you I've also had my civilian academic career about how I have seen since the 1980s layer upon layer upon layer of excess bureaucracy. More additional deans and so forth. While the teaching personnel, there are many universities in America where there are more bureaucrats than there are teaching personnel. Even by the way, when I was a dean and a bureaucrat, I still taught courses and was directly responsible. So I still stayed in the classroom because of bureaucrats. Anyway, look at our layers. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, the National Security Council, which coordinates all the military and civil security agencies, had 50 staff members. And we dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had a much bigger military with 50 staff. Now we have close to 400. You want to know why they can't make a decision. The more layers of bureaucracy, and I can give detail in the questions, the staff is going to hell. Marshall upended the system. He actually simplified it. He took this incredibly complex bureaucracy in the War Department, and he broke the Army into the ground forces, the air forces, and the service forces. Again, he's my model, gold standard. Petraeus, it takes 2 years to write doctrine. We're in the middle of a war in Iraq, and here the Army, the standard company men telling us, the bureaucrats, it's going to take 2 years to write new Army doctrine. Well, we'd already been fighting people for years, since 2001, September. And we don't have a counterinsurgency doctrine. And Petraeus said he would do it in a year. And I was part of the team of 10 people that wrote that doctrine. Actually, we wrote the doctrine in 4 months, just like they did when Marshall is told that it's going to take 2 years for a new Army doctrine in 1940. He has a team of people assembled, and they write a new doctrine in 4 months. We wrote the doctrine in 4 months, had a very good draft. Then it went through layer after layer after layer of Pentagon comments. And I could tell you about that. And it came out to be actually, the later product was not as good as the things because of the input from the layers of bureaucracy who knew nothing about that, but bureaucrats have to do something. Last thing, I want to bring in a little family history there. That smiling, dashing-looking two-star general, Major General Bennett Myers. And I was talking about the B-29 didn't work. He was the chief of the Army Air Forces Materiel Command in the middle of World War II. He controlled billions of dollars in defense money. A billion was a lot of money. And he was an engineering genius. He made the B-29 system work. And that was the most expensive program ever. But he had a slight character flaw. And on his little character flaw is that he thought of himself as a little bit of a financial genius. So while he was making the B-29 work, he set up dummy corporations using his wife and his secretary and some others, shell corporations, and he subcontracted to himself, and then he subcontracted around. Anyway, he set up it was a Biden level kind of, shell company thing. Well, he stole lots of money while he was building the B-29 and winning World War II. And my father had worked for a bank before he went in the Army, there were some accounting difficulties coming up at the end of World War II, and my father was one of the team of investigators that sent Major General Bennett Myers was the first West Point Major General ever sent to prison for war profiteering. And, they got him in the first charge where he'd simply stolen, embezzled $25,000. But my father and the other people were following up on this vast trail of phony corporations and so forth. And unfortunately, it was an embarrassment for the government. And there had been a lot of war profiteering and things, and the Republicans were back. Truman was embarrassed, so they simply dropped the investigation midway through, tried him in the first charge, put him in the pen for 2 years, in the penitentiary for 2 years, and forgot about it. But my father said, and he was part of this accounting team, he said, he stole millions. And that was $1 million was a lot of money then. And he stole millions, and they never could find it. They found a lot of it, though. Just interesting that this is World War II, the greatest generation, everybody patriotic. And this guy is in many ways a hero. His name is still in various places, and he's mentioned by Hap Arnold's memoirs as making the B-29 work. But otherwise, it's like Orwell. He's been memory holed. And you will find very few references in the Air Force to Bennett Myers. Today, we have so many scandals going on in the military, but there's good news, and for the younger people here, I'm going to tell you about how to get rich. This happened this year. One of the biggest defense contractors, and I've had dealings with them actually, Booz Allen Hamilton, they do a lot of think tank work and so forth. They ran into, they're a multi-billion defense company, and they ran into, I guess one of their projects was losing money. So they simply decided to double the bill for their other projects. And they had a former woman, Marine, who said, you can't be doing this. This is not following procedure. Oh, don't worry about it, Well, there's a 1862 Civil War law called the False Claims Act. And it was to fight war profiteering, and it's still in effect. If you get the goods, get the information that somebody is stealing, filing false claims, stealing from the government, you can get something like, when the money is recovered, you can get 25% of the settlement. So this one woman who had warned the company and complained and told to shut up, she left the company, filed the evidence that she had, and this huge defense firm was forced to pay $377 million. This is a very recent case. And the former Marine officer got $69.8 million of that settlement. So get really smart, learn to do security studies, go to work for a company like Booz Allen Hamilton. I can recommend half a dozen major defense companies, and just be quiet, watch what's going on, and then when you catch them stealing so many millions, you can say, turn them in, and you can get a quarter of what they stole. So anyway, I think it's pretty cool. I will never make in my lifetime $69.8 million. And no, I think that that great officer for doing that. There was a scandal in the Singapore, the Fat Albert scandal, a Singapore contractor paying bribes. They're considering whether to send an admiral to jail. He's been found guilty. We had captains and admirals. One of the things that happens is the ideologues again, and why it's gotten so bad, is 1990s. You had military housing, came under family housing, barrack, came under the post commander, or the base commander. It was usually a Navy captain, Army colonel. And the housing comes under the post engineer, who's usually a civilian, works for the Corps of works for the Army as a civilian. And they have their housing office, and they contract locally under federal rules competitively to have housing built, to have housing maintained, and so forth. And the mission of the people in the housing office is to have good housing and do the job properly. Well, and everything was working. The houses were maintained, houses were built, barracks were maintained, they were clean, and so forth, because the Army actually owned the process. Although they used contractors to do it, they controlled it. There was a budget, East Post. Again, it comes along post-Gulf War I. This is back in the Clinton era. Business is more efficient than the Army. This is one that Americans always love. And I would agree that business, I'm in favor of capitalism, but I'm also, if you read The Wealth of Nations in Adam Smith explains the glories of competition and the free market and how it works. He didn't invent capitalism, he explained it. But then, repeatedly, Adam Smith, and I have it on my Kindle, I go back and reread it, while saying that business and free markets are great, and I agree with him, says, every time the businessmen get together, they're going to try to rig the system and mess things up, and you've got to watch out for the businessmen trying to rig the system. You have to read Adam Smith to get the real effect. And I'm a true believer in capitalism in the Adam Smith manner. And the idea was that if you turn over military activities like housing, then for-profit companies will do it so much better than military bureaucrats. Well, as it turned out, there have been gigantic scandals. And companies, tens of millions of dollars put in. We had military housing full of mold, with children getting sick, with bad water, and so forth. And the company certified they'd been inspected. And of course, America has a housing code. We have rules and laws. And they just lied like mad. Companies were found guilty of criminal fraud and forced to pay fines. And then they kept up the contract for housing with the same companies been found guilty of criminal fraud. Nobody went to jail. By the way, when you have billion-dollar companies, you have political influence, and people don't want to send you to jail. It was hard enough to send a major general to jail in 1946 than it was. I would argue, I've mentioned, I had to, dealing with contractors, we had contractors to train the Iraqis. One of the problems in Iraq is we went to people like Boozel and Hamel, or some of the big corporations, and said, can you provide us interpreters? Oh, yes, sir, we can do that. And train security. Oh, yes, we can do that. And some of the people who were at the Abu Ghraib scandal, they were contract interpreters, completely incompetent, completely incapable, but the companies made gigantic amounts of money. By the way, if you're a military guy and you want people trained, want something done, you go, if you're dealing with soldiers, you say, do it. Oh, it's going to, if they talk back to you and say it's going to take 18 hours of solid work, then you'd laugh at them, because you can make a soldier, sailor, airman work long hours and they don't get overtime. But you ask a civilian to work extra hours, sure, we're happy to do that. Now, you have to, we're going to sit down with our lawyers and renegotiate the contract, because you're going to have to pay us a lot more money because you didn't contract for that crisis that came up that needed to be done. And they do that. And they promise a lot. I do not believe that we should have basic military functions like training troops, like doing security, like managing the housing, done by for-profit companies. One interesting thing about that ideologue, McNamara, Ford company president, U.S. Navy till 1965 operated its own shipyards. Not all of them. They had lots of private shipyards that had contracts and did a great job. Electric Boat made submarines. But USS Missouri, the battleship where the surrender of Japan was signed, that was built at Brooklyn Naval Shipyards. U.S. Navy owned its own shipyards. And they were building wonderful ships until 1965. But McNamara said, no, civilian industry can do it better. You can look at the current issue of the littoral combat ship. We spent billions of dollars to build a series of combat ships for the U.S. Navy, an entire class. And it was so bad, and the cost overrun was so great, but they don't work. They're scrapping a whole series of something like 8 ships. They're scrapping before they deploy them to operations because they can't be used. Talk about waste of money. I mean, it would have been better to just take the money out, the billions out, and burned it. Maybe instead of coal or something, maybe. But some of the scandals that have come along. And so we need to really rethink the whole bureaucracy thing. I would estimate about easily 20-25% of the defense budget of the U.S. is pure waste, incompetence, and inefficiency. And it's partly due because of these. In many cases, we had well-functioning housing system, well-functioning shipyards, well-functioning, the reserves used to do a lot of the kind of work. We used to be very good at training third world nations. And then we hired contractors. And ever since we've hired contractors, we used to win wars when we actually trained the people ourselves. Now that we're hired contractors to train them, we've been losing all the wars. But, and it costs a lot of money. Anyway, we need to do more things in-house. And I always thought it was amazing that we will go out, Pentagon will go out and they will hire a civilian corporation to do studies when, like the Air Staff called me up, the military, I worked with some really great people. And the people that actually wrote the provisional plan for occupying Iraq, which the ideologues threw out, so we had no plan. We actually created a good one. These were military people that got no extra money. I, by the way, didn't get a penny for being one of the authors of the counterinsurgency doctrine. I was happy to do it. They told me, we want you to do this. And I said, yes, sir, I'm a good soldier. I'll do this. Every time you deal with a civilian, you're having to pay all this extra money, and then the corporation has to make money. If you are an employee of a corporation, what's your first loyalty? Corporation and corporate profits. My first loyalty, since my paycheck doesn't get larger if I do extra work, my first loyalty is to the mission and get it done. And I think that most of us in the U.S. military act and think that way. And most of us who have been academics in the military, and we've got some great people. So why they are going outside the house to huge corporations that donate large amounts of money to politicians, I wonder if there's a relationship there. Who knows? Well, I'm sorry. At this point when we're getting on, I know that issues of like political donors, corruption, knowing the right people, politics, and it wouldn't happen in Spain, and that this is purely an American issue of how corruption works. But we have, no, seriously, I spent a lot of my life in Europe. I have a lot of good friends in the Bundeswehr and the British military and other armed forces in Europe. And we could have a wonderful discussion sometime about just what the bureaucracies do. And it might not even be illegal, but essentially on how the waste and inefficiency that's in defense. I'm in favor of I think we could have a much bigger and better U.S. military for a lower price. And it would hurt a lot of corporations. But anyway, I've probably gone on too much, but I just wanted to close up. Lastly, having taught officers, you cannot take a smart person and make him a strategist. What you can do is what Marshall did, and I've done this as a teacher, there are always people out there that have really great qualities as critical thinkers. And you want to, and education, military education will help them and develop them. But if they don't have a certain level of real ability, and I can think of students I've taught that stand out for people who would potentially be very fine strategists because they just had that critical thinking. A good model is the U.S. Army War College in the 1930s, actually, which produced a lot of our strategic leaders, and they focused in the 30s on coalition warfare against Germany and Japan. They assigned War College students to actually do studies for the War Department War Plans Division, because the War Plans Division was understaffed, and some great studies were done. And they were done by students. Well, students who were lieutenant colonels and majors who were professional officers. But, I taught at the War College, why does the Pentagon go out to a contractor, even RAND, when we have very bright majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels at the war colleges who could be put to work doing research? In fact, specialists, weapons specialists, all kinds of logistics specialists, you have more expertise in your military officers than you would in, let's say, somebody working for a civilian corporation. Why do we constantly take things that work? And so anyway, we need, from the academic view, we need to get rid of a lot of the think tanks and the corporations, which have had, actually, I can tell you, in Iraq and Afghanistan, a very negative effect. And we need to go back to using our own people in the War College. And it's cheaper to make majors and lieutenant colonels do these things than hire academics at a few $100,000 a year. Anyway, I've probably gone on too long. I do hope you have some questions and some maybe contentions, if you like, because I think right now the idea of strategic leadership and how we get it is a very important one when we're dealing with the kind of crises right now. And I don't think we've got a lot of great strategic leaders out there, and that makes me nervous. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James. As you know, as a better lecturer, there is no proper lecturer without the Q&A.
Yes, sir. Oh, no,
So-
I'm happy.
Molt bé. Molt bé, doncs tenim més o menys 20 minuts i aviam, com sempre, podem fer ja la sessió de preguntes i respostes i ja ho sabeu, ara és cosa vostra, el van passar el micro. Així doncs, qui comença?
Did you understand my English pretty well? Yeah, except for things like deer in the headlights. Well, I hope you do that expression, maybe boar in the headlights.
Let's start again.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I understand that in military and with all this bureaucracy, you have that there's no limitation on resources. Sometimes they have that, but how do you see strategic leadership? How do you see the role of priorities in a strategist?
Well, I think that, and the reason I brought up a LeMay and a William Tunner is they literally upended the system, and Marshall upended the system. They realized that the whole process of creating the strategy for World War II and creating the doctrine, and even in 1940, U.S. military had this established bureaucracy and this is how to do things. And we would have failed if he had not upended the system. One of the great things about Marshall is that he had, as Chief of Staff of the Army, he had to go before Congress and explain himself all the time. And a lot of the Congress was very hostile. You had Democrats and Republicans on both parties on both sides, members who were religiously against any military buildup. You know, here's the war in Europe, and you have Americans not willing to build up our own armed forces. So he had to up. One of the talents is that sometimes you have to upend the bureaucracy. Now, in the case of Colin Powell, he ends up America being very successful. And then a new administration came in under Clinton, and they actually forced him out early. Here's one of the most successful chairmen we've ever had, and they force him out early. That was the bureaucracy taking over and the ideologues. And unfortunately, all too often, the ideologues take over, and the ideologues get along with the bureaucrats. And they get along, go along. I have not thought up a complete model or understanding. I'm actually right now just to keep trying to think it through. But in thinking of the qualities of a good strategist, you have to be able to change the organization, because our organization is often broken. One of the first things, after 9/11, we needed to change our organization. We're in a conflict with non-state people, and our organization wasn't working. What they did is they created new layers and new systems that made it worse. And that is what really gets me is how we do that. So now I'm not I've been around some strategic leaders. I know that we have the talent, but the problem is that our system is actually keeping good leadership away from us. So I don't know. But one of the key things, if you ever, in facing any kind of military situation, you need to look at how you're organized and redo it. And Tunner did that. LeMay did that, and rather ruthlessly and rudely, but they got things done. Marshall was rarely rude, but yes, he was cold-blooded. He had to fire people who we had known for decades because they couldn't meet, they weren't efficient. They weren't up to things. So you have to a good strategic leader ought to be one that can deal with the organization. Norstad was great at dealing with the Europeans and dealing with the NATO organization. I don't think we've had a really talented Supreme Commander in Europe since Norstad.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I have several questions, but basically I'm not very clear on the difference between a planner, a strategist, and a leader. Specifically, the difference between a planner and a strategist, because a lot of the characteristics you've been describing are really top-grade planners, and I don't see where the strategy comes in.
Oh, well, I can only do it by illustrating the reasons. I think being a good planner is a requirement to be a good strategist, but not all good planners are good strategists. The predecessor to Loris Norstad as Supreme Commander in Europe was General Grunther. General Grunther had made his reputation as a war planner. He had played a central role as the main planner in Mediterranean operations. We're talking the Sicily landing and the southern France landing, Torch landing, which require, and especially when you get to Salerno, there's nothing more complex than dealing with an amphibious landing and requiring air support. I can't think of any other military operation. And Grunther was an obsessive micromanager. And by the way, if you're planning an amphibious landing, whole armies on hostile shores, you need an obsessive micromanager to think through all the details. And he had a tremendous mind for doing that. Well, they made him Supreme Commander in Europe. Now, one of the problems in being a superb planner is that he would travel around to military units in Europe. This is in the 50s. And he would go and he would go to a battalion, an American garrison or German garrison, and he would ask the battalion commander about his battalion defense plans against a Russian offensive. And they'd pull out the defense plans and he'd look at that. And all I can think is, you are the Supreme Commander in Europe. You have brigade commanders, division commanders, corps commanders, army group commander, army land forces commander in Europe to worry about battalion defense plans. That's not your job to be to worry about that. Norstad came in, and of course, my father was on the NATO staff in the 50s. And he remembered Grunther. Norstad comes in like a breath of fresh air. Norstad has all kinds of other officers to worry about battalion defense plans. He assumes that his ground forces commander, air commander, naval commander will do their jobs and have good plans. Norstad focused on German rearmament, making it work. NATO needed a German army. Getting the mid-range ballistic missiles in Europe, negotiating the nuclear weapons in Europe. And actually, Eisenhower and Norstad were in favor of Europe having an independent nuclear deterrent. They didn't think the U.S. should control it. But he's Berlin. What do you deal with the Berlin crisis? This is the things that the NATO commander focused on. This is what my father thought of as the big picture. Grunther was one of the great strategic planners, but very often, I'm glad you brought this up, when people reach up to the very top level, the higher strategic level, they revert to what they're comfortable with. And Grunther reverted to being a a really good micromanager, conventional war planner. And what you needed, again, was somebody really doing the diplomacy of nuclear weapons and all of that. And why Norstad was a great strategist, but Grunther doesn't. Grunther was a great war planner. He doesn't go down on the list of great strategists. So that's where the difference comes in. But I don't think that you can be a great strategist if you aren't competent and you have to prove your competence. And Norstad had been, this is what happens for Marshall picked people out of the war plans department and the Air Corps war plans division. And he saw the supreme performers there, and then he promoted them, you know, and people were jumping from major to brigadier general because of their quality of their minds that they exhibited. So I probably rambled, but yeah, there is a difference between a war planner and a strategist, and that's Grunther to Norstad. And I've seen both types, by the way. Because your Norstads are very rare, but I've seen lots of Grunthers. I've seen lots of officers, when they reach a high point, they want to relive the time that they were a captain and really knew their armor stuff or something.
Hello. Could you please tell us, if you like it, your thinking about which is the national interest and the goal of which is right now serving the USS Gerald Ford?
Well, the one thing, and remember, Colin Powell was intensely disliked by many in the Pentagon and in the government, because they would come up and say, let's do some good in the world. And Colin Powell would, and that's just one of the key questions. He would say, now what is our national interest in doing this? Do we have a clear objective going into, say, Somalia? What resources? What are going to be the and he would just ask the questions. It was pretty clear. Now, if we talk about the Cold War, which I was in, I was stationed in Germany with a Pershing missile unit. Now, we had very clear national interest in those days in NATO. I came back to when Colin Powell asked those questions, and when you ask a lot of your politicians and your senior defense people in Washington, well, what's our national interest? Have you thought this through? They get very upset. They do not like being asked these questions. He said, what is our end state, and do we have any idea of once we go in, how we're going to get out? And that's what I wrote about bad strategies, is you had 4 cases, and I used France, Britain, and America, because those are 3 great democracies. And I didn't see this at first. I looked at how France failed, how Britain failed, how America failed. And the reasons were virtually the same. And it was very, very similar in how you fail. And basically you have very bright people, you have a good process, and you have these ideologues who insert themselves, no dissent, put you on a policy that break the process. And you have the Walt Rostow. Instead of having a process of actually understanding how to deal with the North Vietnamese, you bomb 94 targets. And eventually, the McNamara and a key group of ideologues get us in a Vietnam strategy, and then by 1968 we have to get, Johnson resigns and we got, or decides not to run again, and we have to get out of Vietnam, and we have no idea. When I became Dean of the Baltic Defense College January 2009, the interest in the Baltic states was they were about to have, every 10 years or so, they have a new NATO strategic concept. All of NATO meets and they agree on a collective strategic position. And the Baltics were very, very worried that with the end of the Cold War, that the Western Europeans and the Americans and the Obama administration come in, were going to dump collective security. The Baltic states have a very clear idea of national interest. National interest is protecting them from the Russians. And if you were in the Baltic states, this is very understandable. So the Eastern Europeans who I worked with were all believers in collective security and against you-know-who, against Russia. And Western Europe said, well, no, maybe we can just drop this whole collective security thing. And there was a big push in the US government to drop collective security and we'll make NATO into a kind of feel-good organization and we'll invite the Russians to sort of take part and we'll go around the world and we'll send troops and we'll intervene in places to make them better. And I was actually tasked, this is using in-house, I was an employee of the 3 Baltic defense ministries, so why not use me? I was actually told to help out some of the Baltic diplomats who were eager to put out a very coherent case of keeping collective, Article 5, collective security as the core of NATO. And eventually the Baltics and Eastern Europeans won. But it was actually a battle. We did at Baltic Defense College a lot of studies and a lot of support because I speak pretty good English. I gave, by the way, the Baltic diplomats are wonderful English, but I maybe helped them a little bit in crafting the wording of various things. So on the issue of strategic interest, I was working for my employers, the 3 Baltic states, and against a lot of the interests of the Western Europeans and the Americans, who we thought were pretty dumb and naive when it comes to Russians. And in 2010, they actually agreed that, yes, we're going to keep collective security, and I'm glad we did, and I'm glad I played my role. But the interest is what is national security? Well, the Americans had no idea, and the Western Europeans don't have an idea of what national security is. Now, if you have a border with Russia, you know, you have an idea what your national security is. But collective, I agree. Again, I didn't go against my own conscience. I wouldn't do that. I completely, by the way, agreed with my Eastern European colleagues in the Baltic states about NATO should be more focused on collective security, and I am not happy at the idea of out-of-area operations and so forth. And in fact, I agree. Now, I'm glad that NATO and our allies, and I'm very, very recognizing of the fact that we had great European support in places like Afghanistan. The problem in Afghanistan is you had different countries, provincial reconstruction team. There was no coordination body. Every provincial reconstruction team sort of reported to the ISAF headquarters. There was nobody that actually put doctrine out or guidance for the provincial reconstruction teams. To talk about organizational failure, that's a case where we did need some kind of organization. There were so many glaring things. But again, a national interest is usually a pretty clear thing, I think. I don't think that you need to get into sort of sophisticated questions of soft power. I think you should really have the clear things. Anyway, I don't believe that we have to, I think it was necessary to fight the Taliban. I think a lot of our other policies were awful. But no, in national interest, it's the first question you ask. And, you know, is it in our national interest to do this? Well, is it worth my life to do this? No. Or your kid's life, or my grandson, or my nephew, or whatever. if you want to do that. I don't, because I have so many people in my family in the military. My brother and I were both in the Army. My Uncle Bill was West Point. He was badly wounded in Korea. My father, a few other uncles. My grandfather broke the Gothic Line in 1944 in Italy. So my cousin was in the Marine Corps. Those are just the ones I can think of offhand. So if you come into a military family like mine, the issue of, is it worth people's lives? And this is one of the reasons I love Dwight Eisenhower. He actually thought about the lives of his troops. Of course, that's why we did the mean things we did to Japan. That was to save, well, my father and my uncle's life. And that was in the national interest. It's a tough question.
Good evening, sir. So my question is, as a military leader, how do you deal with politicians? I mean, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, if President George Bush ordered to attack those countries, what can you do as a military leader if you disagree or you see that?
Well, okay, if the President of the United States and Congress passes a resolution and authorizes the use of military force as an officer, whether I agree or not, that is legal and proper, and my job is to obey orders and do what I'm told to do. So if Congress says, well, we need to intervene to help Haiti or something, I may think it's a dumb idea, but I will obey orders and do that. I won't do things that are utterly illegal or immoral, but it's not up to me. Now, when you're dealing with politicians, and the few times I have, is, again, Marshall is my gold standard. He didn't lie to them. He didn't prevaricate. He educated them. He told them the details as he knew them. He knew in 1940-41, as the U.S. began to mobilize, there'd be a lot of corruption. There would be, we were building military bases everywhere, and there would be crooked contractors. So Senator Harry Truman, he proposes his committee in the Senate to investigate profiteering and crooks and cheats. And all of the company men in the War Department, the Navy Department, say, oh no, they're going to go after us and this and that. And Marshall says, no, there's going to be corruption. So our position is that we're going to cooperate in every way with the Congress and give them the information they need. And we're going to, if they uncover some crooked contractors, we'll thank them for it, and we will cooperate completely. Now that is proper civil-military relations, which we have not had for more than 30 years. Proper civil-military relations is when the civilian guy, I can play both roles, but when the civilian politician asks me something, and I will tell him the truth, even if he doesn't like to hear it. That's my policy, is to be honest with them. And unfortunately, I know a lot of officers that will prevaricate, will be company men who will not give politicians the answers that they like to hear. And that's one of the biggest problems. On the other hand, the civilian needs to go respect military expertise, and when the military expert tells them some very practical facts of life, there needs to be respect and honesty on both sides. And unfortunately, we have a military-civil relationship that doesn't work. And I don't think it works very well in Europe either, from what I've seen. I don't think the politicians want to get honest answers from their military, And the French, a bunch of French generals said, look, our force structure, you're giving us missions that we can't do and that there's a crisis here. And in fact, they're absolutely right. The Germans, for the most part, they let their military decline so far. They don't have ammunition. They don't have working equipment. Most of their jets don't fly. Most of the submarines don't fly. And there are only a few, now the job of military guys to tell the civilian leaders, first of all, the budget is way too low and what needs to be fixed. But, no, the civilians don't have the proper respect for the military expertise, and the military are often not willing to tell the civilians the truth. In our society, the civilians are the bosses. They run the military. My father didn't get to decide these things. He was a soldier. He went where he was told. And even if he thought it was a stupid idea. And I remember, this is when I was a kid, and Presidio, San Francisco, and my father, I was at the tennis court, and I was drinking Coke. On the other end of the table is my father and two other majors. He was a major at the time. And they were talking about the buildup of stuff going on because 1963 we're sending a lot of people to Vietnam. Things are building up. LeMay had sent a lot of people to train the Vietnamese. And the Americans were there in fairly large numbers in 63. And my father and the other two majors who had all fought in Korea were all thinking, maybe we ought to be careful about this Vietnam thing. And maybe this is not the place to go and fight the communists. But I just got parts of the conversation because I'm a little kid. But when I think back, and the military gets attacked for being warmongers, it was in the 1960s, it was the military that was resisting. And Ridgway is the supreme example in the 50s, resisting going into foreign conflicts. Remember, Colin Powell's whole Powell doctrine is not, let's not go to war, let's think it through before we go to war and have really good reasons. So I was brought up by military people that were, now in a war, you don't want to mess with my family because your life expectancy will not be very long. But if it's before the war, and you don't want to be fighting against us, because we're actually good at what we do. But before the war, we actually like to think through all of these issues. And if you look at Vietnam, it wasn't the military that said, let's go and do this. A few of them. It was the civilians. It was the McNamara and Wastow and the ideologues, McGeorge Bundy, all those people around first Kennedy, then Johnson, that were pushing to get us into Vietnam without thinking of the national interest, without asking the question of the end state and all these things. Very much the case in Afghanistan and Iraq is the military had been cowed by having Colin Powell fired because they should have been. The Army Chief of Staff, before we invaded Iraq, General Shinseki, testified in front of Congress. He said that it looks like you are giving a 12-division mission, and we only have 10 divisions, to a 10-division army. And he testified to Congress that he was worried that that this was way too much for the Army mission. And they sacked him for it. So when you fire a guy, and by the way, he was absolutely right. When you fire a guy wearing a uniform for saying something intelligent, you're in a terrible problem. But so anyway, the military people that I know, if it's before the war, and it's a question of getting involved, we're pretty cautious. Now, once you order us to go and fight somebody, we'll do the best we can, which is pretty lethal, actually. I mean, I've wouldn't have wanted to ever fight my uncle or father or grandfather. Oh, okay, I'm rambling. But no, these are really the tough questions. Yeah.
Farem una última pregunta, és perquè estem arribant al final del temps que teníem previst.
Thank you. A question about history and predictions, since you have studied history extensively. From your point of view, how do you think the world will look in, let's say, 15, 20 years? I mean, it's quite unpredictable, the world, and a war can pop up in any place, anytime, but there are some trends, China growth and containment, but for how much? Russia wants her vengeance, but do you think there are other trends that will change the face of the world, and will the US be up to the challenge?
Well, at the very beginning of Iraq, I could see, and I went there, I did my best for my part. I could see that it was going to fail. I mean, you could actually see the train wreck coming. It was very easy to do. My friends who served in Afghanistan, and remember that began in 2001, when they were there in 2007 and 8, they could see it was already going to fail. Sometimes predictions aren't very hard. We were already so bad on the wrong trajectory on things. Now, I'll tell you, I'll make a couple predictions. One, Russia will still be an adversarial power. I think we need to treat them differently. I think we should be working full out to get peace in the Ukraine. Keeping that conflict going is lunacy, and I think every European power and the Americans should be putting pressure to bring about an armistice and a negotiated solution, which will probably not make the Ukrainians completely happy. But so Russia has such a nationalist ideology. My wife is fluent in Russian, and she specializes in studying Putin, and we could have a beer and talk about Putin and the Russian ideology. Russia is going to be a difficult country to handle, and things won't be easy with the Russians. Like I said, dealing in the Baltic states, we had the perspective of, actually I think the Baltics are much safer now that Sweden and Finland, which are right next door, have joined NATO, which have very capable air forces, and the Baltic states is much better protected. But Russia will still be in an adversarial position. China, well, we could predict, China is so much in debt with real estate, and you probably read about their investment crisis, and they have built such a house of cards that if their economy crashes, which it pretty much has to do with that kind of real estate bubble, and huge numbers of Chinese become unemployed, poor. The average Chinese doesn't love the Communist Party. I have friends there who've taught in China, and people express their open contempt for the corruption and the incompetence. But if China has massive unemployment and economic problems, you could see the regime worrying very much about their internal stability. Things could get really, really ugly in China because you have this incredibly, we talk about corruption in defense spending and our government. Well, China is the world exemplar of corruption and incompetence, and how long can they sustain with their real estate problems? So I predict certainly there could be very soon some really severe economic problems. Of course, I would never trust the Chinese. They shot my Uncle Bill back in 1952 during one of the hill battles. He recovered, but he was badly wounded, and we haven't really liked the Red Chinese since. And by the way, the Red Chinese have taken 2 of my books, bought the translation rights, and they are using 2 of my books for instruction in the Chinese military staff colleges. So if I only found out when I got my royalty check and I saw some nice bonuses in there and it said translation rights. I had to call up and find out. I still haven't been sent the Chinese copies of my books, but I would like to see that. So it is scary when the Red Chinese military is using me for their military education. But no, I can predict. I would never predict 15 years out. I can predict 5 years out though. And in the next 5 years, let's see what happens. Russia will be a messy situation. I hope we don't go to escalate things. China will be the really interesting stuff. That how they deal with their mess. I have not been to China. I've been to Asia a few times. I have friends in Singapore and the Philippines. Nobody likes China. Nobody trusts them. And nobody should. And nobody should like them. I mean, there are lots of people in reality, having been in NATO and lived in Europe, that like Americans, like French, British, and we have, it's like family. You know, we get really angry within the family at our cousins who do stupid things, but they're still family. China is just, everyone fears them. Everyone respects their power, but no, nobody trusts them. Nobody likes them, and you know, I think they're in for trouble. So that's my prediction. Oh, very good questions. I'm in the process of thinking through a lot of these things myself, and you are helping me out in doing that, because I have some of these things written out in draft already. But I appreciate your contributions and questions. Thank you.
Okay, so